Picture this, it's 1675. A group of armed men, farmers, blacksmiths, shopkeepers, gather in the town square of a small Massachusetts village. They're not soldiers preparing for war. They're not vigilantes seeking revenge. They're the local militia, and they've been summoned to hunt down a gang of highway robbers terrorizing the colony. These weren't professional lawmen. They had no badges, no formal training, and certainly no police academy diplomas. Yet for over 150 years, colonial militias served a dual purpose that most Americans have completely forgotten. They weren't just the backbone of military defense. They were also the primary force for controlling crime and maintaining order in their communities. When we think of colonial militias today, we imagine Minutemen facing British redcoats at Lexington and Concord. But long before the Revolution, these citizen soldiers spent far more time chasing thieves, suppressing riots, pursuing runaway servants, and enforcing colonial laws than they ever did fighting foreign enemies. Today, we're uncovering the surprising and often troubling story of how ordinary citizens with muskets became America's first law enforcement, and how their legacy still shapes debates about guns, policing, and community safety more than 2 centuries later. Historical context and background. To understand the role of militias in colonial crime control, we must first understand what militias actually were, and why they became essential to maintaining order in early America. The English militia tradition. Colonial militias were transplanted from English soil, where the militia system dated back centuries. In England, the Assize of Arms, 1181, and the Statute of Winchester, 1285, established the principle that all free men had both the right and the obligation to keep arms and serve in defense of the realm. This wasn't just about foreign invasion. It was about maintaining internal order when formal law enforcement barely existed. When English colonists arrived in the New World, they brought this tradition with them, but the American environment transformed it dramatically. In England, militia duty was often ceremonial by the 1600s, with professional armies handling most military needs. In America, militias became absolutely vital for survival. The colonial militia structure. Every colony enacted militia laws requiring able-bodied white men between roughly 16 and 60 years old to serve. This wasn't voluntary. It was mandatory civic duty, like taxes or jury service. Men were required to provide their own weapons, typically a musket, powder, and shot, attend regular training musters, and respond immediately when called upon. The colonial militia was organized at the local level, typically by town or county. Officers, captains, lieutenants, sergeants were usually elected by militia members or appointed by colonial governors. These officers were rarely professional soldiers. They were prominent community members, wealthy landowners, successful merchants, or respected farmers who commanded through social status as much as military knowledge. The dual mission, defense and law enforcement. Here's what most history books overlook. Colonial militias had 2 distinct but interconnected missions. The first, which everyone remembers, was military defense, protecting settlements from Native American attacks, Spanish or French forces, and eventually British troops. But the second mission, equally important but largely forgotten, was internal security and crime control. Why did militias take on law enforcement duties? Simple. There was no one else to do it. Colonial America had constables, sheriffs, and night watches, but these were tiny, part-time, often ineffective forces. A town might have 1 constable and a handful of elderly watchmen. When serious crime occurred, organized theft, violent riots, escapes from jail, slave rebellions, these minimal forces were completely inadequate. Enter the militia. When a constable couldn't apprehend dangerous criminals, he could request militia support. When civil disorder threatened community safety, militia officers could muster their men to restore order. When enslaved people revolted or Native American raids occurred, the militia was the only organized armed force available. The legal framework. Colonial laws, explicitly authorized militias for law enforcement purposes. Militia acts didn't just address warfare. They empowered militia officers to suppress riots, routs, and unlawful assemblies, pursue felons, enforce quarantines during epidemics, and maintain public order during emergencies. Militia captains could summon their men at any time, not just for military threats. A militia muster might be called to search for escaped prisoners, hunt down robbers in the countryside, enforce unpopular laws, break up illegal gatherings, or intimidate communities into compliance with colonial authority. This created a unique system: armed citizens who were simultaneously community members, part-time soldiers, and law enforcement agents. They weren't professionals, but they were organized, armed, and legally empowered to use force to maintain order. Regional variations. The militia's law enforcement role varied significantly by region. In New England, where settlements were compact and relatively homogeneous, militias primarily handled military threats and occasional riots. In the Middle Colonies, with more diverse populations and urban centers, militias increasingly dealt with crime and civil disorder. But in the Southern colonies, militias developed a particularly troubling law enforcement function: slave patrols. Beginning with South Carolina in 1704, Southern colonies organized special militia units specifically to terrorize enslaved populations, hunt runaways, prevent rebellions, and enforce slave codes. These patrols were militia units by another name, armed citizens organized under militia laws to control populations through force. The militia in daily life. For ordinary colonists, militia service meant regular interruptions to daily life. Muster days, typically monthly or quarterly, required men to gather for training, inspections, and exercises. These weren't pleasant social gatherings. They were mandatory obligations enforced by fines for non-attendance. But militia service also created social bonds. Men trained together, drank together, and relied on each other in emergencies. Militia companies became social institutions, and militia officers were community leaders. When crime threatened or disorder erupted, these relationships meant militias could mobilize quickly with men who knew and trusted each other. This was the system that maintained order across colonial America for over a century, a patchwork of armed citizen soldiers who were farmers on Monday, law enforcers on Tuesday, and potential warriors on Wednesday. Now let's see how this actually worked in practice. Case studies/real-life examples. To understand how militias actually functioned as crime control forces, we need to examine specific historical incidents that reveal both the system's effectiveness and its dangers. Case Study 1. The New Jersey Land Riots, 1745–1754. In the 1740s, a series of violent conflicts over land ownership erupted in northern New Jersey, ultimately requiring militia intervention that blurred every line between law enforcement, military action, and political repression. The conflict's roots lay in competing land claims. Some settlers held titles from original proprietors who received grants from King Charles II in the 1660s. Others held titles from the governors of New York, who claimed authority over the same territory. Both groups believed they legally owned the land, and neither would yield. By 1745, tensions had exploded into open conflict. Settlers with East Jersey proprietary titles, backed by wealthy landowners and colonial authorities, began forcibly evicting settlers with New York titles. The evicted settlers, mostly poor farmers who had worked the land for decades, fought back. What started as individual disputes escalated into organized resistance. The settlers with contested titles formed their own armed groups, burned survey markers, attacked sheriffs trying to enforce eviction orders, and freed prisoners from jails. They weren't random criminals. They were organized, armed, and convinced they were defending their legitimate property rights against corrupt authorities. Local constables and sheriffs couldn't handle the situation. The resistors outnumbered them, outgunned them, and had community support. Colonial Governor Jonathan Belcher faced a crisis. organized armed groups openly defying legal authority across multiple counties. Belcher's response: mobilize the militia. In August 1746, Belcher issued a proclamation declaring the land rioters to be in rebellion and ordering militia commanders to muster their companies to suppress the disorder. This is where the story gets complicated, because many militia members sympathized with the rioters, and some were rioters themselves. Militia Captain John Bainbridge of Newark faced an impossible situation. He was ordered to muster his company to arrest land rioters. But when he called the muster, fewer than half his men appeared, and those who did appear included men who had participated in the riots. When Bainbridge tried to lead them to arrest specific rioters, the militia members simply refused orders and dispersed. The militia, supposedly the instrument of law enforcement, had become unreliable because its members were drawn from the very communities whose interests conflicted with colonial authority. Governor Belcher responded by assembling a special militia force from distant counties, offering bounties for service, and essentially creating a quasi-mercenary force of militiamen who had no local ties to the rioters. In November 1746, this special force, numbering about 150 men, marched into northern New Jersey. What followed was less law enforcement than military occupation. The militia force occupied the town of Newark, arrested dozens of suspected rioters, often without warrants or evidence, seized property, and intimidated the population. They weren't investigating crimes or making surgical arrests. They were using overwhelming armed force to crush resistance. Samuel Baldwin, a farmer who held a New York title, was arrested by militiamen while working his field. No sheriff served a warrant. No constable read charges. Armed militia members simply seized him, marched him to a makeshift jail, and held him without trial for 3 months. When he was finally brought before a court, the charges were vague: rioting and resisting lawful authority. The militia's actions during the New Jersey land riots reveal several crucial aspects of militia-based crime control. First, militias were politically controlled instruments. They enforced whatever laws and property arrangements the colonial government favored, regardless of whether those laws were just or had community support. Second, militias were unreliable when their members' interests conflicted with orders. Local militias couldn't be trusted to enforce unpopular laws against their neighbors. Third, when local militias proved unreliable, authorities created special forces drawn from distant communities, essentially mercenary militia companies with no local accountability. Fourth, militia law enforcement often resembled military occupation rather than policing. The goal was overwhelming force and intimidation rather than investigation and due process. The land riots continued sporadically until 1754, when a combination of legal compromises and exhausted resistors finally ended the conflict. But the episode demonstrated that militias were double-edged swords, powerful tools for maintaining order, but also instruments of oppression when that order meant enforcing unpopular policies through force. Case Study 2: The Stono Rebellion and Slave Patrols, 1739, South Carolina. Perhaps no case better illustrates the militia's role in crime control, and its most disturbing applications, than the Stono Rebellion of 1739 and the slave patrol system it strengthened. On September 9, 1739, about 20 enslaved Africans near the Stono River south of Charleston, South Carolina, raided a store, seized weapons and ammunition, and began marching south toward Spanish Florida, where they hoped to find freedom. Spain had recently issued a proclamation offering freedom to enslaved people who escaped from English colonies, a deliberate strategy to destabilize British settlements. As they marched, the rebels killed approximately 25 white colonists, burned plantations, and recruited more enslaved people to their cause. By afternoon, their numbers had grown to perhaps 6,100 people. They were marching in military formation, beating drums and flying banners. This wasn't a mob. It was an organized attempted exodus and revolt. South Carolina's regular militia system swung into action. Lieutenant Governor William Bull, who happened to be traveling near the rebel march, encountered the group and immediately fled to raise the alarm. He rode to the nearest militia captain, who sounded the alarm that mobilized militiamen across the region. Within hours, a militia force of approximately 100 mounted and armed colonists assembled and pursued the rebels. The decisive confrontation came that evening at a field where the rebels had stopped to rest, believing they had enough lead to safely pause. The militia attacked. The battle was brief and brutal. Militia members shot and killed approximately 40 rebels on the spot. Others were captured, interrogated, and executed over the following days. Some rebels escaped into the swamps and woods. Militia patrols hunted them for months afterward. When captured, they were executed, often by beheading, with their heads displayed on pikes along roads as warnings to others. The militia response to Stone was swift and effective by the horrific standards of suppressing slave rebellions. But the aftermath reveals how the incident fundamentally shaped the militia's role in Southern crime control. South Carolina's white population was terrified. They were outnumbered by enslaved people nearly 2-to-1, lived in constant fear of rebellion, and recognized that their entire economy and way of life depended on suppressing black resistance through overwhelming force. In 1740, the South Carolina Assembly passed the Comprehensive Negro Act, which dramatically expanded controls on enslaved people, but also formalized and strengthened the slave patrol system. This system was explicitly organized as a militia function. The slave patrol system worked like this. Militia officers in each district were required to organize regular patrols of armed white men who would patrol roads, inspect slave quarters, break up gatherings of enslaved people, enforce pass systems, whip enslaved people found without authorization, and hunt runaways. Service on these patrols was mandatory for white men, just like regular militia duty, and enforced through fines for non-attendance. Thomas Cooper, a militia captain in St. James Parish, organized weekly patrols beginning in 1740. His patrol consisted of 10-15 militiamen who would ride through plantation areas at irregular times, typically at night. They had authority to stop any black person, demand papers, search quarters without warrants, and administer punishment on the spot, typically whipping, for any violation of slave codes. These patrols weren't investigating crimes that had occurred. They were engaged in preemptive control, using terror and violence to prevent crimes. From the colonists' perspective, any resistance or assertion of freedom by enslaved people was criminal before they happened. The diary of militia officer William Stevens records an 1743 incident that illustrates how these patrols operated. Stevens' patrol encountered 3 enslaved men traveling together at night without passes. By law, enslaved people needed written permission from masters to travel. The men claimed they were running an errand for their master, but had forgotten their pass. Without any investigation, trial, or attempt to verify their story, the militia patrol tied the men to trees and whipped each 20 times. Stevens recorded this as routine patrol duty, not worthy of special note, except as documentation that his patrol had fulfilled its function. This was militia-based crime control in its most systematic and brutal form. The crime being prevented was black freedom. The law being enforced was racial slavery, and the militia was the primary instrument for maintaining this system through organized violence. The slave patrol system would continue throughout the colonial period and into the antebellum era, eventually evolving into institutions that would shape Southern policing for centuries. Many historians argue that modern Southern police departments emerged directly from these militia-based slave patrols, a lineage that helps explain persistent patterns of racialized policing. The Stono Rebellion and its aftermath demonstrate that militias weren't neutral law enforcement tools. They were instruments for maintaining specific social orders, and in the South, That meant enforcing slavery through terror. Case Study 3. The Boston Impressment Riot, 1747. Not all militia involvement in crime control meant suppressing the poor or enslaved. Sometimes militias were deployed against ordinary colonists asserting their rights, revealing tensions between legitimate protest and disorder, and showing how militias could be used to enforce unpopular policies. In November 1747, Boston was tense. Britain was at war with France, King George's War, and the Royal Navy desperately needed sailors. The solution: impressment, forcibly seizing men and compelling them to serve on naval vessels. This practice was deeply resented by colonists who saw it as tyrannical kidnapping. On November 16, Commodore Charles Knowles, commanding a Royal Navy squadron in Boston Harbor, sent press gangs ashore to seize sailors and laborers. The press gangs swept through waterfront neighborhoods, grabbing men from taverns, workplaces, and even homes. They impressed not just sailors but also tradesmen, laborers, and even some protected individuals who by colonial law were exempt from impressment. Boston erupted. Within hours, a crowd of several thousand colonists, sailors, dock workers, craftsmen, and ordinary citizens, gathered on the streets. They seized several British naval officers as hostages, surrounded the governor's house, and demanded the release of all impressed men. The situation was rapidly escalating from protest to riot to potential insurrection. Governor William Shirley faced a crisis. The mob controlled the streets. British naval officers were held captive. Royal authority was being openly defied. And his normal law enforcement tools, constables and night watch, were either sympathetic to the rioters or too frightened to intervene. Shirley's response: call out the militia. Here's where things got interesting. When Shirley ordered militia officers to muster their companies and disperse the riot, most militia members simply didn't respond. The militia companies drawn from Boston's North End and waterfront neighborhoods refused to act against their neighbors, relatives, and fellow workers. Some militia members were actually participating in the riot. Captain Thomas Hutchinson, commanding a militia company in the North End, later testified that when he attempted to muster his men, he was confronted by a delegation who told him bluntly, "We will not fire on our own people to protect the British Navy's tyranny." Hutchinson realized that attempting to force the issue would either result in his men ignoring orders or potentially turning their weapons on him. The militia, theoretically the instrument of governmental authority, had become unreliable because its members sided with the rioters. Governor Shirley eventually negotiated a resolution. Commodore Knowles agreed to release the impressed Bostonians, though he kept men impressed elsewhere, and the rioters released their hostages. The crisis ended not through militia enforcement of order, but through political compromise. The Boston Impressment Riot reveals several crucial lessons about militia-based crime control. First, militias were deeply embedded in their communities. Unlike professional police or military forces, militia members lived among the people they were ordered to control. This created divided loyalties when orders conflicted with community sympathies. Second, colonial authorities couldn't rely on militias to enforce unpopular policies. The militia's effectiveness as a law enforcement tool depended on community support for the laws being enforced. Third, when militias proved unreliable, authorities had few alternatives. Governor Shirley couldn't simply fire the militia and hire new enforcers. The militia was composed of the entire able-bodied male population. If they wouldn't act, he had no force available. Fourth, this incident foreshadowed revolutionary resistance. Just 28 years later, colonial militias would refuse orders to suppress resistance to British authority and would instead fight against British troops. The same dynamics visible in 1747 would explode in 1775. The impressment riot demonstrated that militia-based crime control was fundamentally different from professional policing. Militias could enforce laws their members believed in, but they couldn't reliably enforce laws they opposed, making them powerful for maintaining community values but problematic for enforcing unpopular governmental policies. Social impact and analysis. The militia's role in colonial crime control profoundly shaped American society, creating patterns and assumptions that persist even today in debates about guns, policing, and community safety. The militarization of civic life. First and most obviously, the militia system meant that violence and military organization were deeply woven into the fabric of ordinary civic life. Modern Americans often treat military police functions as separate from civilian life. Soldiers and cops are them, distinct from us. Colonial Americans experienced no such separation. Every able-bodied man was simultaneously a civilian, a soldier, and a law enforcement agent. Your neighbor who plowed his fields on Monday might be suppressing riots on Tuesday and hunting criminals on Wednesday. Violence wasn't something professionals handled on behalf of the community. It was something the community itself organized and administered. This created a society that was remarkably comfortable with armed citizens organizing to use force for public purposes. The idea that ordinary citizens with their own weapons could legitimately enforce laws, maintain order, and resist tyranny became embedded in colonial political culture, ultimately influencing the Second Amendment and persistent American attitudes about gun ownership and self-defense. The problem of selective enforcement. The militia's embeddedness in local communities created both strength and weakness. The strength: militias understood local conditions, had community legitimacy, and couldn't easily become distant, impersonal enforcers divorced from those they policed. The weakness: militias enforced laws selectively, based on whether they agreed with those laws and whether enforcement served their interests. We saw this in the New Jersey land riots. Militias refused to enforce evictions against sympathetic neighbors, and the Boston impressment riot, militias refused to suppress legitimate protests. This meant colonial law enforcement was wildly inconsistent. Laws that communities supported were vigorously enforced through militia action. Laws that communities opposed were effectively nullified by militia noncompliance. And laws that served the interests of powerful groups, particularly property owners and slaveholders, received disproportionate enforcement attention. The racialized foundation of militia policing. Perhaps the darkest aspect of militia-based crime control was its explicit role in maintaining racial hierarchy through violence. Slave patrols, organized as militia functions, created a system where white citizens were legally obligated to participate in terrorizing black communities. This wasn't incidental. It was central to how militia policing worked in the South. Young white men learned that part of civic duty was controlling black people through violence. Social bonds were built through shared participation in patrols, and the entire white community became complicit in maintaining slavery through mandatory militia service. This created a white supremacist civic culture that equated law enforcement with racial control. The effects persisted long after slavery's end, influencing Jim Crow policing, lynch mobs, and modern patterns of racialized law enforcement that draw direct lineages from colonial slave patrols. The absence of accountability. Militia-based crime control operated with virtually no accountability mechanisms. When militias suppressed riots, hunted criminals, or patrolled slave quarters, they answered primarily to their officers and colonial governors, both drawn from the same elite social classes whose interests they served. Victims of militia violence had no recourse. There were no oversight boards, no internal affairs investigations, no civil rights lawsuits. If a militia patrol whipped an enslaved person unjustly, killed a suspect without cause, or destroyed property while suppressing disorder, the victims had no remedy. This lack of accountability meant militia policing often descended into abuse. The same men who were neighbors and community members during peaceful times could become brutal enforcers when given organized weapons and legal immunity. The legacy of community arms. Finally, the militia system created lasting American assumptions about the relationship between community safety, gun ownership, and resistance to tyranny. Because colonial Americans experienced militias as both law enforcers and potential resistors of oppressive authority, they developed a unique perspective. The same armed citizens who maintained order could also check governmental abuse. This dual nature, militias as both instruments of authority and potential resistors of tyranny, would become central to revolutionary ideology and would shape constitutional debates about armed citizenship that continue today. Modern connections, reflection. The colonial militia's role in crime control seems distant from modern American policing, yet its legacy reverberates through contemporary debates in surprising and often troubling ways. The Second Amendment's hidden context. When Americans debate gun rights today, they typically frame the Second Amendment as being about either individual self-defense or resistance to tyranny. But the colonial militia experience reveals another dimension. Gun rights were historically tied to law enforcement functions. The founders didn't see armed citizens and law enforcement as opposites. They saw them as identical. A well-regulated militia wasn't just about resisting tyranny. It was about ordinary citizens maintaining order in their communities. When we debate whether civilians should have access to military-style weapons, we're echoing colonial debates about what armaments militias needed to fulfill both military and policing functions. Understanding this history doesn't resolve modern gun debates, but it does complicate simple narratives on both sides. The colonial militia wasn't just about liberty. It was also about control, often exercised in ways we now recognize as oppressive. Community policing and its discontents. Modern law enforcement increasingly embraces community policing that supposedly empowers communities to participate in their own security. But the colonial experience reveals how problematic this can be. Colonial militias were the ultimate community policing model, drawn from communities, led by local figures, enforcing community norms. Yet this often meant enforcing the prejudices, interests, and power dynamics of those communities. Militias protected property owners against the poor, whites against blacks, and elites against challenges to their authority. Modern community policing faces similar dangers. When police are embedded in communities, whose interests do they serve? Do they protect everyone equally, or do they enforce the preferences of dominant groups? The colonial militia experience suggests that without external oversight and universal rights protections, community-based law enforcement naturally reproduces existing hierarchies. The lineage of racialized policing. The direct line from colonial slave patrols to modern policing is increasingly recognized by historians and activists. Southern police departments often emerged from militia-based slave patrols, inheriting their tactics, assumptions, and purposes. This history helps explain why racialized policing persists even after formal legal equality was achieved. The DNA of American policing, particularly in the South, includes the militia's role in controlling black populations through violence and intimidation. Calls to defund the police or fundamentally reimagine public safety often cite this history, arguing that institutions born from oppressive purposes can't simply be reformed, but must be replaced with entirely different approaches to community safety. The vigilante impulse. When modern Americans form armed groups to protect neighborhoods, patrol borders, or respond to perceived threats, they're channeling the colonial militia tradition, often unconsciously. These groups see themselves as fulfilling the historic militia function, armed citizens maintaining order when they believe official authorities have failed. But colonial history reveals the dangers. Such groups typically enforce the interests and prejudices of their members, lack accountability, and can quickly slide from maintaining order to vigilante violence. The same dynamics that made colonial militias problematic, selective enforcement, lack of oversight, embeddedness in power structures, reappear in modern armed citizen groups. The professionalization question. Perhaps the deepest question the colonial experience raises is whether professionalization of policing was progress or loss. We gained trained, accountable in theory, law enforcement but lost community embeddedness and shared responsibility for public safety. Some reformers argue we should reclaim elements of the militia tradition, communities taking responsibility for their own safety rather than outsourcing it to professionals. Others argue the militia system's abuses demonstrate why we need professional, externally accountable police forces insulated from local prejudices. The colonial militia experience doesn't answer this question, but it does remind us that every system involves trade-offs. The militia system had community legitimacy but enabled local tyranny. Professional policing can provide universal standards but can become disconnected from communities and serve state rather than local interests. There's no returning to militia-based crime control, nor should we want to, given its role in slavery and oppression. But understanding that history helps us think more clearly about what we want from modern policing and what dangers we must guard against. So what was the militia's role in colonial crime control? It was central, complex, and deeply contradictory. Colonial militias weren't just military forces preparing for war. They were the primary organized instruments for maintaining order, suppressing disorder, and enforcing laws across early America. When crimes threatened communities, when riots erupted, when enslaved people resisted their bondage, when colonial authorities needed force to back their commands, militias were the answer. But this answer came with enormous costs and complications. We saw militia members refuse to enforce evictions against their neighbors in New Jersey, creating a system where law enforcement depended on whether the community supported the laws. We witnessed militias systematically terrorizing enslaved populations in South Carolina, revealing how crime control could mean enforcing racial oppression through violence. And we observed militias fail to suppress the Boston impressment riot, demonstrating that community-based enforcement couldn't reliably serve unpopular governmental interests. The militia system created a society where armed force was democratized, spread across the entire white male population, rather than concentrated in professional hands. This had genuine benefits. It prevented the emergence of a professional military caste that might threaten liberty. It gave communities real power to resist tyrannical authority, and it created shared civic responsibility for maintaining order. But it also had catastrophic costs. It made violence a routine part of civic life. It enabled local prejudices and power structures to be enforced through organized arms. It created a system where the enslaved and the poor had no protection from abuse, and it established patterns of racialized violence that would persist for centuries. Understanding this history matters because the militia's legacy lives on in American culture and politics. When we debate gun rights, we're debating who should have access to the tools of force, a question the militia system answered by saying all white male citizens. When we debate community policing, we're debating whether law enforcement should be embedded in communities or stand apart from them, a tension visible in colonial militia experiences. When we confront racialized policing, we're confronting institutions whose origins lie partly in militia-based slave patrols. The colonial militia experience doesn't offer simple lessons or easy answers. It shows that armed citizens can maintain order but also oppress their neighbors. It demonstrates that community-based enforcement can be legitimate but also tyrannical. It reveals that democratized force prevents professional military tyranny but enables community tyranny. Now it's your turn. Knowing this history, how do you think about modern debates over gun rights and self-defense? Should communities have more direct responsibility for their own security, or does the militia experience show the dangers of that approach? Can we reclaim the militia's positive aspects, community responsibility, resistance to tyranny, while avoiding its oppressive legacy? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if this deep dive into forgotten history opened your eyes to how much we've misunderstood about colonial America, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss our next historical investigation. Remember, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes, and the echoes of colonial militias still sound in our debates about guns, policing, and who keeps us safe. Until next time, keep questioning the stories we tell ourselves about the past.